There is a carving on a wall in southern Egypt that ancient priests hid underground, in a chamber so cramped you have to crawl to reach it. And in that carving, a man holds up an object the size of his own body, a long, sealed glass bulb. Inside it, a snake stretched from end to end like a glowing wire. And running out the base of that bulb, a cable, thick and braided, leading back to a box held up by two human arms. If you saw that image, with no label, no context, no history attached to it, you would not say religious symbol. You would say light bulb. And you would not be the only one. For over 100 years, engineers, physicists, and electricians have looked at this exact carving and said the same thing out loud. That is not a god. That is a device. The Egyptians who cut it into that wall left hieroglyphs around it explaining what it was. And when those hieroglyphs were finally translated, word for word, sign for sign, the official meaning that came back did not settle the argument. It made it stranger. Because the words the priests carved beside that object describe a serpent that gives light. A serpent enclosed in a vessel. A serpent whose brilliance rises up into the sky. And the room it sits in, buried under a temple, has one detail nobody has ever been able to explain. There is no smoke on the ceiling, no soot, no black stain of any torch or oil lamp that would have been needed to carve in the dark. A finished, detailed relief made underground in total blackness with no evidence of fire ever being used to light the work. So here is the question this whole video is going to chase. If they didn't use fire to see down there, what did they use? Today, we are going to decode exactly what the hieroglyphs say. Follow the object through 3 separate clues carved into the same wall, and reach the one thing the official translation still cannot account for. Stay with it, because the strangest part is not the bulb, it is what the writing calls the thing inside it. The carving sits in a place called Dendera. It is a temple complex on the west bank of the Nile, near the modern town of Cana, a few hours north of Luxor. The main building is the Temple of Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and light. Most of what tourists photograph is on the ground floor and the roof. But the object we are talking about is not up there. It is below. Beneath the stone floor of the temple runs a network of hidden passages the Egyptians called crypts. Narrow, low, sealed for most of history, and only opened to visitors now with a separate ticket. You go down a tight staircase into a corridor barely wide enough for one person. And there, on the wall, at the exact coordinates 26 degrees north, 32 degrees east, is the image the world now calls the Dendera Light. These crypts were not meant to be seen. They were the most secret part of the entire complex, sealed storage for the temple's most sacred objects, the cult statues of the gods, made of gold and precious stone, kept in darkness, and only brought out on festival days to be carried up to the roof and touched by the sun. The Egyptians thought of these underground rooms as the duat, the underworld itself, the hidden place beneath the living world. Whatever was carved down here was not carved for the public. It was carved for the priests, and for the gods, and for the dead. That is a strange place to draw a light bulb, unless the light bulb was itself something sacred, something guarded, something that belonged in the most protected room in the building. And the first thing you need to understand is that this is not one carving. It is a set of them. The same object appears again and again through the crypt and the chambers above it, in slightly different forms, like a sequence of diagrams. Researchers who cataloged them counted 3 main objects, each split into 2 matching halves carved in 2 separate rooms, one half in the south crypt and the other half in a chamber directly above it, as if the scene were meant to be read across the levels of the temple. Some show 1 vessel, some show 2, some show the snake fully inside, some show it half emerging. And that repetition matters, because a single strange image can be a coincidence. A repeated, refined, varied image carved in matched pairs across multiple rooms is something else. It is a subject being documented from more than one angle, the way you would document a machine. The temple that holds them is younger than most people assume. The Dendera you can visit was built in the final centuries of ancient Egypt, in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, roughly the 1st century before Christ, on the foundations of far older shrines going back to the Old Kingdom. On the outside south wall of that same temple is one of the only surviving carvings of Cleopatra herself, the last pharaoh, standing beside her son. So the crypt carvings are not the work of some forgotten Stone Age culture. They come from the sophisticated, literate, mathematically advanced Egypt of its final age, an Egypt that traded with Greece and Rome, an Egypt at the height of its accumulated knowledge, right before the lights went out on the whole civilization. Whatever is in that crypt was carved by people at the end of a 3,000-year story, not the beginning of it. Now here is where the mainstream steps in, and to be fair to them, their explanation is not stupid. Egyptologists say this is a scene from a creation myth. The bulb is not a bulb. It is a lotus flower stylized and stretched. The snake is the god Harsamtus, also called Har-Sima Tawi, a form of the sky god emerging from that lotus at the dawn of creation. The oval bubble around the snake is a womb, the belly of the sky goddess Nut, out of which the sun is reborn every single morning. The cable is not a cable. It is a sacred boat, a barge, that carries the sun across the sky. And the box at the end, with the 2 arms, is a jade pillar, one of the most common symbols in all of Egyptian religion, meaning stability, endurance, the backbone of a god. Snake, flower, womb, boat, pillar. A picture of the universe being born. Beautiful, poetic, and on paper, complete. Except the people who first pushed the other reading were not fantasists off the street. They were people who work with electricity for a living. And what they saw was a Crookes tube. A Crookes tube is a real piece of equipment, an early electrical device from the late 19th century, a sealed glass bulb with a wire running through it that glows when you run current through the vacuum inside. It is the ancestor of the neon light and the old television screen. Put a photograph of a Crookes tube next to the Dendera carving, and the resemblance is not vague. The elongated glass envelope, the single filament stretched down the middle, the connection point at the base, the support underneath. It is close enough that when electrical engineers first saw it, they didn't laugh. They went quiet. The idea reached a mass audience through a Swiss writer named Erich von Däniken, the man who made ancient astronaut theories famous, and later through an Austrian named Peter Krasse and an electrical engineer named Reinhard Habeck, who wrote an entire book arguing the carving was a working lamp. Critics dismissed them, and some of that criticism was fair. But notice what the critics were forced to do. They could not simply say the resemblance isn't there. It plainly is. They had to argue that the resemblance is a coincidence, that a 1st century Egyptian priest with no knowledge of electricity happened to arrange sacred symbols into a shape that would perfectly match a device invented 2,000 years later. That might be true, but it is a much bigger claim than it sounds. And that is the reason this carving refuses to die as a mystery. It is not that it looks a little like a light bulb. It is that it matches a specific technology, feature for feature, that would not be invented for another 2,000 years. For decades, the argument stalled right there. One side saw a myth, the other saw a machine, and it was a stalemate of opinions. Until someone did the obvious thing. They stopped guessing about the picture, and they read the words next to it. Because the Egyptians did not leave this carving silent, they wrapped it in hieroglyphs, a full caption carved into the same wall, in the same hand, at the same time. And if you want to know what the object actually was, you don't ask a modern engineer, and you don't ask a modern priest. You ask the person who made it. So let's read exactly what they wrote. This is where the 3 clues begin. And the first, One is hiding in plain sight, in the translation everyone already agrees on. The inscription above the object was translated directly from the temple wall, and the words are on record. It reads, "Words spoken by Har Sema Tawi, the great god who resides in Dendera, the living Ba in the lotus flower of the day solar bark, whose perfection the two arms of the Jed pillar carry as its image, while the Kas, on their knees, bend their arms." The caption even records the material and the size of the object it describes. Gold, all precious stones. Height, 3 hands. A second inscription, above the figure on the left, describes another of these objects as the noble snake, whose statue is carried by the god He, whose shape is admired by his serpents, who comes as unique, enveloped by his serpents. Material, gold and metal. Height, 4 hands. That is the official translation, not a fringe reading, the mainstream one. And here is the first clue, sitting right inside it. The phrase, living Ba. In Egyptian belief, the Ba was a part of the soul, but the word carried a second meaning, a force, an animating energy, the thing that makes a dead object move and live. The text is saying that inside this vessel is a living force, a powered thing, something enclosed that is described as active, alive, radiant. And notice the practical details the priests bothered to record. The material, gold and metal. The height, measured in hands, that is not the language of pure poetry. That is the language of an inventory. Someone was cataloging a physical object, its substance, and its dimensions, the way you would log a piece of equipment. Now read the mainstream version again. A living force, sealed inside a vessel, made of metal, of a specific size, whose brilliance rises up. The priests are telling you there is energy inside the container. The disagreement is only about what kind. And that is the whole trap of this carving. Every single element has a religious meaning the Egyptologists can point to. And every single element has a physical function the engineers can point to. And they line up 1 to 1. The snake is the soul of a god. The snake is also the filament. The bubble is the womb of the sky. The bubble is also the glass envelope holding a vacuum. The Jide pillar is stability. The Jide pillar is also, in the electrical reading, an insulator, the thing you mount a live component on so the current doesn't escape into your hand. The cable is a sacred boat. The cable is also a cable. It is as if the same object were built to be read 2 completely different ways, and 4,500 years later, we still can't agree which language it's written in. Before we go further, if you are the kind of person who needs to know what that snake actually was, subscribe, because this channel investigates sealed chambers and buried carvings every single week, and this one is only getting started. Because the second clue is not about what the object looks like. It is about where it was made, and that is the detail that turns an art debate into a physics problem. Here is the second clue, and it is the one that keeps stubborn skeptics up at night. The crypt is underground, fully enclosed, no windows, no shafts, no natural light of any kind reaches the walls where these carvings were cut. And yet, the carvings are there, finished to an extraordinary standard, with clean lines and consistent depth, and no tool chatter, no half-corrected mistakes, the kind of precision that requires the carver to see exactly what he is doing. So the question is simple and physical. How do you carve fine detail for weeks or months in a room with no light? The answer everyone reaches for first is torches, oil lamps, fire. And that answer has a problem, a fatal one. Fire produces soot. Burning oil, burning wick, burning anything coats the ceiling above it in black carbon. Every tomb and every chamber the Egyptians lit with flame carries that signature, a dark stain overhead that survives thousands of years. Go into the Dendera crypt and look up. The ceilings are clean. There is no soot. There is no carbon layer. There is no evidence that open flame was ever used in those passages at all. Now, the mainstream has answers for this too, and you have to hear them, because they are not empty. The first is that the Egyptians used lamps that burned cleaner. Oil with added salt, they argue, burns with far less smoke, so the soot simply never built up. It is a real chemical effect, but it reduces soot, it does not erase it, and it does not explain chambers this deep, this sealed, worked for this long, with ceilings this clean. The second answer is mirrors, a system of polished copper or bronze plates angled to bounce sunlight from the entrance, down the stairs, around the corners, deep into the crypt, relaying daylight into the dark, like a chain of reflections. It is a real technique. It has been demonstrated on the surface, in the open, and here is where it starts to strain. Every reflection loses light. Polished bronze is not a modern silvered mirror. Bounce a beam off it once, and you lose a large fraction of the brightness. Bounce it around the bends, and drops needed to reach a sealed inner crypt, and there is very little left, a dim wash, nowhere near enough to carve razor-sharp reliefs by. To light these chambers with mirrors, you would need a relay of them, each one held steady and aligned by a worker, a human chain of light bearers standing in passages barely wide enough for one body to pass, holding position for hours while someone carves. The explanation exists. It just gets more difficult the deeper you go. And it asks you to imagine a lot of people doing a very awkward job for a very long time. Meanwhile, the object carved on that very wall, in that very room, is a sealed vessel described as holding a living radiant force. The room that should be impossible to light contains a picture of a light. That is the second clue, and it hands you straight into the third, which is the one the pure myth reading has the hardest time swallowing. Because so far, everything has an answer, strained or not. This next detail does not have a clean one. Look closely at the full scene, and you find a small standing figure near the base of the object. It is not the snake, not the pillar, not the lotus. It is a separate deity, a baboon-formed figure, holding two knives, positioned directly beneath the glowing vessel as if guarding it or warning about it. In the myth reading, this is the god protecting the newborn son. In the technical reading, this figure has been interpreted as a warning, a hazard marker, the ancient equivalent of the symbol you put on a high-voltage box. Do not touch. And there is another god, one called He, who appears in only two of the reliefs, exactly the two where the light is shown at its most intense. A figure that shows up only when the brilliance is greatest. In the electrical reading, that is not decoration. That is a diagram noting the condition under which the discharge is strongest. And there is more in the assembly than most people notice. In the technical reading, the small figures shown beneath the vessels have been interpreted as poles, a positive and a negative. The two ends, a current must run between. The braided cable does not just sit there decoratively. It runs from the base of the bulb to the box, exactly the path a wire would take from a component to its power source. Even the direction of the scene has been studied. Egyptologists, reading the boats in the image, note that they travel from north to south, from the boats of the night to the boats of the day. So the sequence has a defined order, a beginning and an end, like steps read off in sequence. Whether you call those steps a liturgy or a procedure, someone laid this out to be followed in a specific order. It is not a random spray of symbols. It is a composition with a flow. And when engineers trace that flow, it runs source, cable, insulator, vessel, discharge, warning. That is the exact order you would document a powered device, from the supply to the hazard. There is one more detail that cuts against the simple pareidolia explanation. The idea that we are just seeing light bulbs because our brains are trained to. Pareidolia is loose. It sees a face in a cloud and moves on. But this carving is not loose. It is tight, repeated, captioned, measured, and internally consistent across multiple rooms. A cloud does not come with an inscription telling you its height in hands. The Dendera reliefs do. Whatever this is, the people who made it treated it as a real, specific, cataloged thing, not a vague symbol. And that is what makes the third clue land. It is not one weird detail. It is that every weird detail points the same direction, and they were all carved by the same hands in the same secret room on purpose. And this is the reveal the whole carving has been building toward. The thing that separates it from every other creation scene in Egypt. Creation myths are everywhere on Egyptian walls. The lotus, the snake, the sun reborn. You find those images in 100 temples. But you do not find them wired together like this. You do not find the snake stretched as a filament inside a sealed envelope, mounted on an insulator, fed by a cable, guarded by a warning figure, glowing at a marked peak intensity, repeated and varied like engineering schematics, in a sealed room with no soot on the ceiling. The individual symbols are ordinary. The assembly is not. Somebody took the standard religious vocabulary of Egypt and arranged it into something that reads, to modernize, exactly like a description of a working electrical device. And the question that will not go away is whether that is an accident of our own imagination, or whether the priests were using the only words they had to record something they had actually seen. Now, this is the part where honest people have to slow down. Does any of this prove that the ancient Egyptians had electricity? The inscription genuinely does describe a creation myth. The words Har Sema Tawe, the lotus, the daybark, the Jed pillar, those are real religious terms that appear all over Egypt in scenes that have nothing to do with technology. The snake in the bubble is a known motif for the sun reborn from the womb of the sky. Egyptologists are not inventing that. It is written on the wall. And the mirror technique for lighting is real, even if it is strained. The grounded version of this story is that a modern mind, trained to recognize light bulbs, looked at an ancient religious image and saw its own technology reflected back. Pattern matching, the same instinct that makes you see a face in a wall socket. That is a genuine possibility, and it would be dishonest to skip past it. But here is what the pure myth reading still cannot fully account for, even at its best. It cannot fully explain the clean ceilings. The soot problem is real, and the mirror answer gets weaker the deeper the chamber. It cannot explain why this particular creation scene, out of all the thousands carved in Egypt, is the one that assembles itself into a functioning schematic, complete with what looks like an insulator, a cable, and a warning marker, when no other creation scene does. And it cannot explain the sheer, obsessive precision of the work, cut in the dark, with a level of control that suggests the carvers could see their own lines perfectly. Even the conservative version of this story leaves you with a room that should not have been possible to make, decorated with an image nobody can definitively read. At minimum, the Egyptians who built Dendera possessed a command of stone, geometry, and lighting that we still do not fully credit them with. The debate is not whether Dendera is extraordinary. It is how extraordinary, and in which direction. And there is one more layer that keeps the mystery from ever fully closing. The Dendera Light does not stand alone. Across the ancient world, other cultures left behind objects that scholars struggle to explain in the same breath. There is a small clay pot from near Baghdad, roughly 2,000 years old, with a copper cylinder and an iron rod sealed inside it with asphalt, that some researchers argued could produce a small electrical voltage if you filled it with an acid like vinegar or wine. Modern replicas of it have actually generated a weak current, the Baghdad battery. Mainstream archaeology says it was most likely a vessel for storing sacred scrolls, and the electrical reading is genuinely disputed. Not proven. But it sits in the same uncomfortable category as Dendera, an ancient object that resembles a piece of technology it has no business resembling, and that appears to be capable, at least in replica, of doing the thing it looks like it should do. Two puzzle pieces, found in different boxes, that happen to fit together. Because if even the smallest version of this is true, if the Egyptians understood how to generate light without flame in any form, whether through a chemical reaction, a phosphorescent material, or something we have not identified, then our history is missing a chapter. It would mean that a technique was discovered, used, carved onto a wall as a sacred and guarded thing, and then lost so completely that we spent 2,000 years calling it a myth. Knowledge does that. It appears, it flourishes, and it vanishes when the people who held it die without passing it on. The Library of Alexandria burned a few hundred kilometers north of Dendera, and with it went an unknown fraction of everything the ancient world knew. The Antikythera mechanism, a geared bronze computer for predicting the movements of the sky, sat at the bottom of the Mediterranean for 2,000 years. And when it was finally understood, we had to admit that nothing of its sophistication reappeared in Europe for well over 1,000 years after it was built. It was real, it was lost, and for centuries, we would have called anyone who described it a fantasist. We assume the ancients were simpler than us because the record is broken. But a broken record is not proof of a simple past. Sometimes it is just proof of how much we have lost. And that is what makes the Dendera crypt so hard to walk away from. The carving is not hidden anymore. You can buy a ticket, go down the narrow stairs, and stand in front of it. The man still holds up the sealed vessel. The snake still stretches inside it like a filament, waiting for current. The warning figure still stands beneath it with its 2 knives. The words are still cut into the stone around it, describing a living force enclosed in light. And the ceiling above it is still clean, still black-free, still refusing to explain how any of it was ever made in the dark. Egyptologists have their translation. Engineers have their diagram. Both are looking at the same wall. Neither can make the other detail disappear. The temple is still there. The crypt is still open. The question is still sealed inside the stone, exactly where the priests left it. If you want to see the other ancient objects that look like technology they were never supposed to have, watch the next investigation on screen right now.